Welcome, everyone. It is December 29th, 2020. This is the Charters of the Faith course of the Wilmette Institute, and we are so pleased to have Sheila Banani back for a second visit. And let's begin with a prayer from the Tablets of the Divine Plan. Please go ahead, Manita.
So this is revealed to the Baha'is of the United States and America, and it's prefaced, whosoever sets out on a teaching journey to any place, let him recite this prayer day and night during his travels in foreign lands. O God, my God, thou seest me enraptured and attracted toward thy glorious kingdom, and kindled with the fire of thy love amongst mankind. A herald of thy kingdom in these vast and spacious lands, severed from aught else save thee, relying on thee, abandoning rest and comfort, remote from my native home, a wanderer in these regions, a stranger fallen upon the ground, humble before thine exalted threshold, submissive toward the kingdom of thine omnipotent glory, supplicating thee in the dead of night and at the break of dawn, entreating and invoking thee at morn and at eventide, to graciously aid me to serve thy cause, to spread abroad thy teachings, and to exalt thy word throughout the east and the west. O Lord, strengthen my back, enable me to serve thee with the utmost endeavor, and leave me not to myself, lonely and helpless in these regions. O Lord, grant me communion with thee in my loneliness, and be my companion in these foreign lands. Verily, thou art the confirmer of whomsoever thou willest, in that which thou desirest. And verily, thou art the all-powerful, the omnipotent. Abdul Baha.
Sheila, you were highly privileged to be with Shoghi Effendi, and the subject of this course is the three charters: the Tablets of the Divine Plan, the Tablet of Carmel, and the Master's Will. And I know he spoke to you about the Tablet of Carmel, and he certainly spoke to you about the implications of the Tablets of the Divine Plan. But why don't you just proceed with what you came to offer? And maybe I'll offer some questions and others can later too. Okay?
Yes, in fact, I count on you asking me questions and sort of leading me to a particular subject, because that will help me remember something to tell you. While we just had that prayer that Abdul Baha concluded that particular tablet with, I thought that I would like to share with you a little bit of what Abdul Baha wrote in that tablet concerning Europe and the war, which was, of course, he wrote this particular tablet in 1916, and the war was ongoing. First World War was ongoing. And since Greece, the country that my husband Amin and I went to open to the faith, Greece is mentioned in this tablet, this particular one. And so let me just start with reading a section that deals with what Abdul Baha had to say about the condition of the world at that time as he sent this tablet to us. And it's addressed from Abdul Baha, where he wrote it. It says, in Abdul Baha's room at the house in Bahji. And he addresses it, he is God, O ye real Baha'is of America. All of it, of course, but I hope that you will have occasion to read it. He says just before the prayer, I wanted to get the, yes. Abdu'l-Baha writes in the tablet, in brief, this world-consuming war has set such a conflagration to the hearts that no word can describe it. In all the countries of the world, the longing for universal peace is taking possession of the consciousness of men. There is not a soul who does not yearn for concord and peace. A most wonderful state of receptivity is being realized. This is through the consummate wisdom of God, so the capacity may be created. The standard of the oneness of the world of humanity be upraised, and the fundamentals of universal peace and the divine principles be promoted in the East and the West. Therefore, O ye believers of God, show ye an effort, and after this war, spread ye the synopsis of the divine teachings in, and then he mentions, I won't read them all, but he mentions all the European countries that in 1916, he is directing Baha'is to go out and settle. And among them, he mentions the country of Greece. And in the next paragraph, he says, in all these countries, like unto the morning stars, shining forth from the horizon of guidance. Thus far ye have been untiring in your labors. Let your exertions henceforth increase 1,000-fold. Summon the people in these countries, capitals, islands, assemblies, and churches to enter the Abha kingdom. The scope of your exertions must needs be extended. The wider its range, the more striking will be the evidence of divine assistance. This is just a portion of that beautiful tablet, but since it mentioned Greece, I wanted in particular to share it with you. Now,
If I may follow up, if you wanted to go ahead, that's fine. You had asked me to ask questions.
I think that you need to ask me a question, and then, because I don't want to repeat, and of course I don't want to repeat a story that I told last time, and I don't remember what stories I told. So,
well,
me.
That's an attainment, Baha'u'llah says, forget all things save God. And I don't know about you, but I'm almost there.
Yes. Tomorrow's my 88th birthday.
Marvelous, marvelous.
So I am grateful that I can remember as much as I do, but it's not a perfect memory of an event that is my pilgrimage in 1956, which occurred so many years ago. What did I calculate? 64 years ago, 1956. And the Guardian, little did we know, was going to pass away in a year and a half's time from the time I saw him.
You must have studied his face many times. What did you see in him?
Well, it's not that easy to study his face, although we were sitting next to each other at the dinner table. That is, he was sitting to my right, and I looked at him, but, I couldn't stare at him. And we were sitting rather closely together. I think I counted 11 of us around the table. Anyway, I will name them again in case there are people who are with us tonight that did not hear me the last time you interviewed me. Of course, Shoghi Effendi, and as I mentioned, he asked me to sit at the head of the table, and the reason for that was because he said, you should sit in the seat of honor because you are a Knight of Baha'u'llah. So he didn't leave it up to me to imagine why he had seated me there. He told me that was the reason. And that was the place that he said I should sit all 7 nights that we shared dinner and conversation over dinner. And that was the only time that I would be with Shoghi Effendi too. And I couldn't write my notes during dinner. So I had to recall things, you know, which I would write after dinner, after a conversation. I would go upstairs to, from where the dining room level was in at number 10 Persian Street. And upstairs in the drawing room, I would sit at the table, which later became the table that the Universal House of Justice members would sit around as their council table. But I didn't know that's what was going to happen when I was there. But I would go upstairs and sit at that table and write my notes. And usually Millie Collins would sit with me. Sometimes Ruhi Khanum would sit with me. And I would say, now, Shoghi Effendi, he said this and he did. And they would sort of help me, you know, remember things as well. So those are Pilgrim's notes, of course, which no one is supposed to take as authoritative in any fashion, but very often they contained the germ or threads of messages that Shoghi Effendi would send to the Baha'i world. So there really wasn't, there wasn't any contradictory information in Pilgrim's notes, my Pilgrim's notes, but they were informal and not as Shoghi Effendi would write in his letters. His speech, his conversational speech was very warm and welcoming and not pedantic or pompous or in any fashion reserved. He spoke earnestly, and yet you were never, I was never thinking that he was lecturing me or anything like that. I don't think I made that comment last time.
You spoke of how he guided you.
Somehow raised your hand.
Oh, please, go ahead. I didn't see. Go right ahead.
She's on mute.
Thank you. Actually, I just wanted to follow up on, yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear me, Sheila? Okay.
Yes, I can
So
hear
I
you.
was following up on Brent's question because that's something I've always wondered is when I think of the guardian, I think that, you know, he literally had the weight of the shoulder, I mean, of the world on his shoulders. And I always think of him that, you know, all the pressure that he had, you know, was that with him all the time? Could he experience any, you know, lightheartedness or joy? But sort of to the question that Brent was asking, did you feel that he was very, did he seem burdened? Could he, you know, enjoy dinner? Could you tell? Was he at all times very concentrated? What was your impression?
It varied. It varied during one evening as well as over the 7 evenings. And it really depended on what was happening in the world, actually, in the Baha'i world. I'll give you a couple of examples. I was there at Rizwan time. I had arrived on the 27th of April, 1956, and my pilgrimage concluded, it included, I should say, both the 9th day of Rizwan and the 12th day of Rizwan. And my pilgrimage concluded on May 6th, 1956. So there you have this period of 9 pilgrimage days, two two of these days were spent in Bachi, in the mansion. Of course, visiting the shrine of Baha'u'llah and staying overnight or 2 nights in the mansion at Bachi. And of course, Shoghi Effendi was not there at that time. So my evenings with Shoghi Effendi were 7 in number, but broken in time span, so that I was in Haifa for a certain number of days, then in Bachi, and then back in Haifa. And since this was Rizwan time, you know what was happening around the Baha'i world. This is a time of elections of Baha'i institutions. And Shoghi Effendi expressed at dinner one night, happily, he had received notification from, and you know, we didn't have email in those days. So notification generally came via cable, which was the fastest route. And every single word, of course, was charged money. So cables tended, as you probably noticed when Shoghi Effendi sends cables, they don't have all of the pronouns and the indefinite articles and all those things that could be omitted, and they contain just essential words. So nevertheless, cables were the fastest way to communicate. And Shoghi Effendi, I remember one night he was happily saying that he had received cables from this country and that country, and he mentioned a couple of these countries, including England. And he was very pleased that he had heard rapidly from them. He, however, had not heard from Horace Hawley, who was secretary for many years of the United States National Spiritual Assembly, and he was not pleased. In fact, he was a little complaining. He said, Horace, meaning Horace Hawley, of course, Horace used to send me cables of the, you know, at the end of the convention, or with news of the National Convention. And he hadn't done so, or perhaps it was delayed. At any rate, he was not happy with this. And then he turned to me and he said, now in Greece, you should model your assemblies. And then he, you know, would connect the best practices of Baha'i assemblies by name. And he said, be more like this country or that country. I thought that was very interesting, you know, that he felt comfortable enough to express his happiness at certain events that were happening in the Baha'i world and unhappiness at other events. And I had the feeling that he was probably like this with all the pilgrims, that he was very frank, do this, avoid doing that, you know, and lots of advice was given in that fashion. Now, I don't know what he thought I could do about it. He obviously had in mind that this was for a purpose when he shared this view. But to me, it was an indication of the informality with which he dealt with Baha'is from around the world who would come on pilgrimage. I said to my parents, why didn't you go on pilgrimage when Shoghi Effendi was alive? My parents were living in United States. Of course, my husband and I, with our baby daughter, were in Greece. I had come from Greece to Haifa. My mother said, we didn't want to go because we thought Shoghi Effendi would ask us, what are you doing for the faith? And we'd have to say, we're not doing anything for the faith. We're not doing enough. And I said, oh, but you missed this opportunity for having pilgrimage when Shoghi Effendi was alive. This, of course, I said to my parents after Shoghi Effendi suddenly passed away in 1957. And the opportunity for meeting Shoghi Effendi and being on pilgrimage would never be the same. But that was the excuse that my parents gave. I don't often say that to people because I don't want to say anything that sounds critical of my parents. It's not critical. It's sad. It's sad. I think that there were opportunities lost by Baha'is who could have perhaps gone. I know many Baha'is, even though this is a request that pilgrimage is made, and many times people go several times to the Holy Land, and even take another pilgrimage. But for many, it's not possible.
Do you wish to share what countries he suggested your assemblies in Greece should model after?
I mentioned the British, I think, and another one was Australia.
They'll be happy to know that. You mentioned to me that Shoghi Effendi talked about racism and materialism in America. Would you like to talk about that?
Yes, it's very important. I am an American, and I was an American pioneering in a German national Baha'i goal. That is, Greece had been given to the Baha'is of Germany and Austria as a virgin territory country goal. And yet Americans were the first to fill that goal of Greece. Later, German Baha'i pioneers did come and were elected to the local spiritual assembly. So it's not that they did not do what Shoghi Effendi had assigned them, but the American Baha'is were told they could go any place and fill any of the 130, I believe it was, or 131 goals of the 10-year plan. I can't remember what I was starting to explain.
We were racism and materialism in America.
Yes, thank you. You're going to need to do that occasionally to remind me. I think it was interesting that Shoghi Effendi, although I was coming from Greece and he was giving me instructions of what to do in Greece, he still was aware that I was an American. And so a lot of the things he said, not the majority, but a lot, pertain to the faith in America. And I wish I could read from my notes, but the best I can do is try to recall. He began to express, at dinner this was, his, and he has written about this as well, I think, so this won't be totally new to you. But with vehemence, he said, the Americans are so proud of their tall buildings and New York. He referred to New York as Babylon. Said they will, trap the people in this so-called vaunted high civilization. And he specifically mentioned New York. it's Babylon. And in connection with this, he said this is an example, of materialism that Abdu'l-Baha spoke so clearly against. But the people have not grasped what Abdu'l-Baha was warning about. And this also applies to race relations. And he says meaning the people, will, I should look at my, I hate to paraphrase, but he talked about the fire, and he said that, repeating the themes that Abdu'l-Baha had after Abdu'l-Baha's visit in 1912 to this country. Said that, they'll be consumed with fire, but fire melds together. It has the capacity to destroy, but also to melt together. And he was referencing particularly race relations at this point. So it's like, this catastrophe apparently is absolutely essential to shake people up to realize that they have not addressed these issues of race relations. And Abdu'l-Baha warned us that this must be done. It's still not done.
You sent to me this note. The Guardian spoke of purging of America because of her materialism and racial prejudice. Will be purged by fire, but fire welds together again. America will lead the world spiritually.
Yes, that's sort of a leap there, but I drew that from looking at my Pilgrim's notes, which I'm not doing right now because it takes me too long to find the place that I want to tell you something from, so I'm recalling it. But that is specifically, here I was serving in Greece. I was not in America, but he wanted to be sure that I knew the urgency in 1956 of something that Abdu'l-Baha had said in 1916, 1914, 1912, all of these times that Abdu'l-Baha told us where we were missing what needed to be done and how urgent it was. And if we didn't do it, what would happen?
Did he say anything specifically that follows directly on what he wrote in The Advent of Divine Justice about the necessity of the believers to be freed from materialism and racial prejudice? Did he say something along those lines, or was he speaking only generally about America?
He only spoke generally about America. I think if I had come just from America and not as a pioneer in Greece, he would have spent more time talking about America. But that was a very powerful evening when he did address these issues with which I was familiar. Of course, I had read Advent of Divine Justice and the World Order letters, and which, I knew what he was talking about.
You said that the Guardian talked about chaos.
Oh, well, that was all part of that conversation, I believe. Yes. And I'm doing a study class right now, of course, via Zoom and on Advent of Divine Justice. And we were just reading last night these passages, which sound like they could have been written this morning. And also World Order of Baha'u'llah, the last letter in there written in 1936 in World Order of Baha'u'llah. Wow.
What you sent to me was what something, or were these your words where he talked about chaos in the world and clarity in the administrative order?
Oh, yes, because he was talking about God's plan and the divine plan. God's plan, the major plan of God, where he describes this, he was referring to this, that it works by chaos, God's plan. That is, we don't have any control over a lot of what happens in the world outside of the Baha'i community. But those things that happen that we would view as chaotic, because society really is not resolving the issues it needs to address in order to function according to the plan of Allah. But the Baha'i community, with its what is termed our minor plan, we work not by chaos, but by clear-cut order, that is guidance, plans, and within this overall plan of God, the goal is the same, but the way it's achieved is entirely different. God's plan doesn't work in any predictable to us way, but our plan, the Baha'i plan, works through the guidance of the institutions of the faith, which unify, protect, and strengthen us if we follow this guidance and these instructions.
The writings of the Guardian abound in clarity. Was that a trait you noticed in what he said in your presence?
Well, he would go from topic to topic, so I can't, but it was all very clear. It's not like he devoted one evening only to one topic. Several things would be discussed. I told you, I think last time, that on the easel next to Shoghi Effendi's left shoulder and my right shoulder, close by, maybe at most 2 feet from me. It's a small dining room that we were eating in. If you go there as a pilgrim, I think they take you downstairs to where that dining room is. And somebody told me that they have the table actually that we sat at. If that is true, then you'll see the table fills up most of the room. But on that easel that I mentioned, 2 different nights, there on one night, the first night, was a drawing made by Mason Remy, who was present at the table among the other hands of the cause at the dinner table. And Shoghi Effendi would address the drawing, and the first one was the temple design that Mason Remy was doing for the Kampala, Uganda temple. And it was a drawing, not a final drawing. And it was there for Shoghi Effendi to look at and make comments about, and which he did at the dinner table amongst the other topics of conversation. He suggested to Mason Remy that he would like something else done with the shape of the windows, or the different elements of the architecture of that building. And then on another night, Mason Remy would come back the following night, with changes, and then Shoghi Effendi would respond to those. And then on another night, there was a design for the temple to be built in Germany. And it had special requirements, which Shoghi Effendi talked about. It needed, by law, German law, a bomb shelter. Now, this is 1956. This is after the Second World War. But the German government required in public, they were preparing in case. And so, other things, the point I want to make is that the topics varied each night.
You mentioned to me, Sheila, that during one of the meals, Mr. Ios mentioned something about the Covenant Breaker buildings, as I recall, at the southeast corner of the mansion.
Well, yeah, you were the one who said it was southeast. I couldn't for the life of me tell you what corner of the building it was. What happened was, I believe it was in this order. Shoghi Effendi one evening, you know, you don't just go to visit the shrine of Baha'u'llah. In those days, you were housed, you were invited by Shoghi Effendi to come on pilgrimage at a specific time. He set the time, and you stayed in the pilgrim house. You were not on your own. I was driven in the Guardian's car to some locations, including Bahji. And so the care of the pilgrim was entirely different experience than it is nowadays. When Shoghi Effendi said that I was to go to Bahji, it was to be for the 12th day of Rizvan, that I was to be in Bahji for 2 days. And the night that Shoghi Effendi told me that he was sending me to Bahji the next day, and he was sending Mason Remy with me, he also mentioned to Leroy Iwas, who was sitting at the dinner table with his wife Sylvia, that there was to be, and this was like I came in the middle of a conversation, because apparently the order for demolition of 6 rooms, I wrote this in my pilgrim's note, but I didn't see this happening. The demolition of 6 rooms, that apparently in part of the rooms was the grave of the builder of the mansion of Bahji, who was not a Baha'i, you know, but the story of the builder is one that you can read, or perhaps have already read. And Shoghi Effendi wanted that grave to be preserved. He said that, and he said at this time, in other words, he did not want it to be disturbed while demolishing the structure nearby it, which was right next to the mansion of Bahji itself. So he instructed, Shoghi Effendi instructed Leroy Iwas, be careful about bulldozing. It's too close, and it could, that action could destroy something. So he was very insistent that, in other words, in my mind, Leroy would have to go to Bahji and oversee this to make sure it was done properly. Now, none of that was being done while I went to Bahji, but apparently Leroy had done it in sufficient time for him to report back to Shoghi Effendi at the dinner another night with glee. He said, 3/4 of the demolition has been accomplished. Everything is fine. Of course, Shoghi Effendi was pleased at that. But this was an instruction being given by Shoghi Effendi to Leroy at the dinner table. So all kinds of things were happening at dinner.
Was it stated that this structure being destroyed had been part of the Covenant Breaker dwellings?
He didn't say that specifically, but I have that in my mind. It's just in my mind. I mean, what structures would he be destroying otherwise?
Yes.
6 rooms, that's quite a lot of building. And I know that the Covenant Breakers, well, they, for a time, even had the whole mansion of Bahji to themselves and let it deteriorate terribly. But of course, it had been in process of repair when I went there on pilgrimage, and now it's in beautiful condition. I haven't been there since 2015, but it, you know, even the paintings on the balcony wall, which when I was there in 1956, they were all faded. You couldn't see them at all. And now they're just, it looks like it was just built.
Did Shoghi Effendi at any point in your pilgrimage mention covenant breaking, or in that sense bring up protection or opposition?
No, nothing in terms of, family. The only incident with a family member that occurred while I was there was a very interesting one. May I just tell it quickly?
Of course, of course.
This was a woman. I was told her name was Shoghi, who was told to me to be a niece of Baha'u'llah's who lived in Nazareth. And she was invited to come to the master's house at number 7 Persian Street on the 9th day of Rizwan for a luncheon that Ruhi Khanum gave. The table was set up in the foyer of the master's house. For those who've been on pilgrimage, when you visit Abdu'l-Baha's house, where you enter is a large foyer. And there was a long table. I don't know, may have been several tables under the tablecloth, more than one, because it was a long table at which about 30 women, including myself, were seated. Ruhi Khanum as well, and all the women that I knew were there, who I saw every day. Jessie and Ethel Revell, the Revell sisters, who were secretaries for Shoghi Effendi from Pennsylvania. They had come to serve at the World Center. Nellie Collins, of course. I mentioned Ruhi Khanum, who was our hostess. And Shoghi Khanum, the niece of Baha'u'llah, was very elderly. Of course, I couldn't speak with her because she didn't know English and I didn't know any language that she knew. But she was seated in a seat of honor, I think next to me. And so that was a family member who was obviously not a covenant breaker because she wouldn't have been included, I don't think, at that occasion. And she came with us up to the shrine of the Bab when the time came that the women were invited to come into the shrine of the Bab for the 9th day of Rizwan celebration. And we heard Shoghi Effendi chanting the tablet of visitation on that occasion, both in the shrine of the Bab and next to it where Abdu'l-Baha is buried, and before they take Abdu'l-Baha to his own shrine, which is being built now.
Could you please describe, did you see Shoghi Effendi walking in the gardens toward the shrine?
Yes.
Could you describe his conduct?
Well, of course, he was followed by a lot of the other Persian men. So I couldn't see him for very long. And I didn't see him, in those days, they separated the men from the women. Even couples that would have been on pilgrimage, Persian couples that would have been on pilgrimage, at the time of going into the shrine, they had one side, don't ask me which side, east or west or north or south, because the side closest to the Eastern Pilgrim House was the side the women went in. And then the men went in the other side. And then, there are those curtains where the center room is, where the Bab is buried. And so the men were on one side, including Shoghi Effendi, who chanted. So I didn't see Shoghi Effendi if he put his head on the threshold, which is possible he did first, and then he may have stood to chant. I didn't see him chanting, but I could hear him chanting.
Could you describe that, please?
Oh my goodness. Well, the closest, and you've heard this from others, I'm sure, the closest to the sound of Shoghi Effendi chanting that I have heard is Ali Naqshbandi chanting Tablet of Visitation. And because he heard the Guardian when he was a child, you know, growing up in the time that he lived in Haifa, he heard Shoghi Effendi chanting. And I, you know, he was the model. The sound was wonderful. My husband always said that he hears Shoghi Effendi's chanting because he understands the words that Shoghi Effendi was chanting. Of course, you know, the Tablet of Visitation is in Arabic, but I believe that he chanted it with a Persian accent rather than an Arab accent. But this I won't swear to because I am not a connoisseur of accents.
Would any of you like to ask Mrs. Banani any questions?
Is my audio,
Maggie?
can you hear me okay? My audio, I know I'm unstable. No.
Yes.
That's all right. I
I'll
can
put it-
hear you.
Oh, you can? Okay, if not, I'll put it in the chat. It's kind of a strange question, but you know, we've been talking about the successorship after the death of the guardian
Oh,
of this
yes, go ahead. It froze for a minute.
rooms. Okay.
Successor after.
Well, I'm just curious if that topic ever came up, either between the pilgrims or, you know, in those.
Maggie dear, can you hear me all right? Because you're frozen, so I don't know if you can,
Okay.
but you can hear me? Yes. I want to tell you that for me, I was 23 years old when I was on pilgrimage. And I was a mother of a young child who by 1956, she was 4 years old. And my daughter, first daughter, we had two daughters. And Suzanne, and as I mentioned, I was 23. And at that time in 1956, Shoghi Effendi was 59 years old, and Ruhi Khanum would have been 46 years old. It didn't even occur to me to ask that question. I don't know why I didn't think of that. Like, what's going to happen? Do you have any children? You know, obviously they didn't have any children, and it didn't look like that was going to happen. So, you know what? It just was not a question that entered my brain. And I have for years afterwards thought, why didn't I think of that? Why didn't I wonder about that? But I didn't. One time, I remember asking Ali Naqshbandi, I was visiting my parents and years later. And I remember saying to Ali, you know, what happens if there's a bomb that falls and the members of the House of Justice are all destroyed and there's chaos? I don't know, I had in my mind, you know, some catastrophe like that. What provisions have been made for sudden, you know, restitution of the institutions if they are at the top, if they meet disaster? Now, this is only because Ali is a relative that I would engage in such a discussion like that. His response, Ali's response to me was, don't worry, we've taken care of it. In other words, he wasn't going to tell me what they have done, but they have thought of these things. They have made plans. They are, you know, like Abdu'l-Baha. we think, my goodness, Abdu'l-Baha put in place Shoghi Effendi, and Abdu'l-Baha was under such pressure here where he might actually have been sent to North Africa. And indeed, other more dire things could have happened. And yet he appointed this child as his successor. And I think what we're finding out, there's always a plan B and probably a plan C. And we don't hear about these things, but if we needed to go to these alternatives, they have been thought about by the people in charge.